All right, so today we're diving deep, really deep into Exodus chapter 3. We're going way beyond just the surface level, hopefully to uncover some hidden gems. And, I think we're going to be able to with all these fascinating sources. We've got a scholarly article about all the symbolism in that burning bush, some theological interpretations of God's name, even a historical analysis of, that whole borrowing jewels thing.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one. I'm excited to dig into all of that with you.
I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. So are you ready to explore?
Absolutely. I mean, Exodus chapter 3, it's really like a foundational layer for understanding the entire Exodus story. It's where Moses' journey begins. We encounter the divine in just such a dramatic way. And it's where we really start to see some of those most profound themes of faith, leadership, and liberation. I mean, it's all right there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's set the scene. We've got Moses just tending his sheep in the wilderness in Midian when he just happens to stumble upon this burning bush. But it's not being consumed by the flames. It's an image that's always been just so captivating, but also just a little bit unsettling. What do you think is a deeper significance of this burning bush?
Yeah, it's definitely more than just a strange sight, that's for sure. This burning bush, it's like a symbol, packed with meaning. One interpretation comes from that scholarly article you shared. It actually connects it to the idea of the resilience of the church amidst persecution. So the bush, it endures the flames, but it doesn't get destroyed.
Yeah.
Much like people of faith, right?
Yeah.
They face hardship and they emerge stronger on the other side.
If you're listening to this, think about a time in your life when you felt like you were going through fire. It could have been a personal loss, maybe a career setback, or just a period of, really intense stress. Did you come out the other side feeling different? Like you'd been refined, maybe even strengthened by the experience? I mean, this whole burning bush imagery, it can be a powerful reminder that we as humans, we can endure a lot more than we think.
I love that connection. It really speaks to our that human capacity for resilience,
Yeah.
for finding strength in those unexpected places. But we can't forget that this burning bush, it's also where Moses has his first encounter with God.
Hmm.
That voice calls out to him, Moses, Moses.
Mm.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yes. And God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Linking back to that covenant made, generations ago. This isn't just some random deity, right? It's the God of his ancestors who's stepping onto the scene and calling Moses to action. How would you describe Moses' reaction, though?
Oh, he's hesitant. Very hesitant. He questions his ability, his worthiness. He even asks, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?
Hmm.
I mean, it's a classic case of imposter syndrome, something I think we can all relate to at some point in our lives, right?
Absolutely. It makes Moses seem more human, more relatable. I've definitely felt that way when I've been faced with a big challenge. But what I think is so interesting is how God responds to this hesitation.
Well, God offers reassurance. He says, certainly I will be with thee. It's a promise of support, guidance, and strength, for when we need it most. And I think that's a crucial takeaway for anyone listening today. When you're facing a daunting task, remember that you're not alone. There's a source of strength you can tap into, something greater than yourself that can guide you and support you along the way.
That line, certainly I will be with thee, it's so powerful. It's a reminder that even in the face of fear and uncertainty that we have something to rely on, something to anchor us. But then Moses asks a question that leads to one of the most profound moments in the entire Exodus story. He asks for God's name.
And the answer he gets, well, is anything but ordinary. God says, I am that I am. That's not just a name, it's a statement. It's a statement of being, of existence. It sets this God of Israel apart from all the other gods of that time.
This I am declaration, I mean, it's had a huge impact on, theological thought, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, think about it. The gods of Egypt and those other ancient cultures, they were associated with specific places or powers.
Yep.
The god of the Nile, the god of war. But I am suggests something so much bigger, like a being who is the source of all existence and not limited by a particular domain.
For the Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt, hearing this name for the first time, it must have been mind-blowing. Imagine having faith in a God who's simply I-S, a God who transcends all the limitations of their world.
I imagine it would have been incredibly powerful, a real source of hope and strength in a situation that felt totally hopeless. It's a declaration of power, but also of mystery. We can try to understand what I am that I am means, but ultimately it points to something beyond our comprehension.
Yeah, it's like trying to wrap your head around, the vastness of the universe, or even the concept of infinity. It's humbling, it's awe-inspiring, and maybe even a little bit unsettling.
Absolutely. It invites us to approach the divine with a sense of wonder and reverence, and to recognize that there's always more to learn and to discover. But this encounter, it's not just about philosophical musings. It leads to a very specific promise.
Okay, so let's talk about that promise. God tells Moses that he will lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into a land flowing with milk and honey. What kind of impact would this have had on the Israelites?
Imagine being enslaved, stripped of your freedom, your dignity, and then suddenly hearing this promise, a promise of a land where life is abundant, where there's prosperity and joy. It would have been such a beacon of hope, a vision of a future worth fighting for.
And it's not just about, material abundance,
No,
right?
it's about liberation in every sense of the word. Freedom from oppression, freedom to worship their God, freedom to build a new life for themselves and for their children. It's a message that still resonates even today with people who are longing for a better future.
It makes you think about the things that we strive for, those personal promised lands. Maybe it's a career goal, a creative endeavor, or a deeper sense of purpose and meaning. What are those things that give you hope, that make you feel like you're moving towards a better future?
That's a great question for everyone listening to think about. But as we explore this promise of liberation, we can't forget that God doesn't try to sugarcoat things. He tells Moses that Pharaoh is going to resist, that there will be obstacles and challenges.
It's a good reminder that even when we're striving for something good and worthwhile, that the path isn't always easy.
Exactly. And that's where that theme of divine support comes back in. God assures Moses that he'll be with him every step of the way.
So we've got a reluctant leader chosen for a monumental task, we've got a promise of liberation, and we've got that assurance of divine support. But there's one more detail in chapter 3 that always seems to spark a lot of debate and conversation.
Or you're talking about the instruction for the Israelites to borrow jewels of silver and gold from the Egyptians before they leave.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where things get a little bit tricky. And it requires a deeper dive into, that historical context and the nuances of the Hebrew language.
It's a fascinating and potentially controversial passage that we definitely need to unpack. But, I think for now, let's pause here and take a moment to reflect on everything that we've explored so far, and we'll dive into that whole borrowing jewels situation and all the different interpretations in our next segment, so don't go anywhere.
Okay, so let's tackle this whole borrowing of jewels thing head on. It's definitely a passage that's sparked a lot of debates and interpretations over the years.
It does. It seems pretty straightforward at first glance, but like a lot of things in Exodus, there's a lot more going on, beneath the surface.
Right, exactly. So before we jump into all of those interpretations, can we rewind just a little bit? You've shared some really interesting historical analysis with me. Can you tell me a little bit about the original Hebrew word, the one that's often translated as borrow?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. The Hebrew word in this passage, well, it actually has a broader range of meanings than just borrow, as we typically think of it today. It can mean to ask or even to request. And in some contexts, it can even carry a sense of like demanding restitution or compensation.
So instead of picturing the Israelites, sneaking off with Egyptian treasures, maybe we could envision a scenario where they're actually making a formal request or even a demand for something that is rightfully theirs.
That is a fascinating perspective. If we consider the centuries of forced labor that they endured, I mean, this request, it could even be seen as a form of reparations, like a way of acknowledging the value of all their work and seeking compensation for all their suffering.
Exactly. It aligns with that whole concept of justice, of righting a wrong.
Hmm.
And if we try to connect this back to the listener's world, I mean, it raises some questions about fairness and equality and the responsibility that we all have to address those historical injustices, even in our own time.
Yeah, it challenges us to think about the ways that systems and structures can perpetuate inequality and what we can actually do to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Now, it's important to remember that this interpretation isn't, universally accepted. Some people do view this passage as condoning taking someone else's property, regardless of the context.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure. With a lot of different perspectives, how do you navigate all those different interpretations while still remaining impartial?
I think it's so crucial to approach these ancient texts with humility and with an awareness of our own biases. We can't impose modern moral frameworks onto a culture that, operated under very different norms and understandings. The goal is to just present the different interpretations, explore their strengths and weaknesses, and then allow the listener to grapple with the complexities. and arrive at their own conclusions.
I really like that approach. It encourages critical thinking, and it acknowledges that there isn't always one simple black and white answer.
So we've explored this borrowing from both a historical and ethical perspective. Now I think it's time to maybe zoom out a bit and consider how this whole episode in Exodus chapter 3 fits into that larger narrative, of liberation and the journey towards the promised land.
Yeah, it seems to foreshadow some of those challenges and complexities that lie ahead. Even though God has promised deliverance, it's clear that there will be obstacles, difficult choices to make, and a constant need for discernment and faith.
Absolutely. And it also highlights that tension that exists between divine guidance and human agency. God is leading the way, but the Israelites, and especially Moses, they have to participate in this journey.
Mhm.
They have to make decisions and face the consequences.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that faith isn't passive. It requires action, courage, and a willingness to trust in something bigger than ourselves, even when the path ahead isn't clear.
I think that resonates with the human experience in general.
Huh.
We all have moments of uncertainty. We all face challenges that test our faith. And we all have to make decisions that require us to step out of our comfort zones.
Mm.
Exodus chapter 3 offers this powerful model for how to navigate those challenges.
Right.
Trusting in a source of strength that's bigger than ourselves and ultimately moving towards a future that's full of hope and possibility.
Yeah, speaking of hope and possibility, can we go back to that imagery of the land flowing with milk and honey for a moment?
Yeah.
It's such a vivid and alluring description. What do you think it represents, beyond just the literal abundance of food and resources?
Well, for me, it represents this sense of wholeness, of fulfillment,
Hmm.
of living in harmony with God and with each other. It's like this vision of a world where there's enough for everyone, where justice and righteousness prevail, and where everyone's potential can really flourish.
It's like this collective dream, this vision of a better future that I think we're all striving towards, each in our own way. What are some of the ways that people throughout history have interpreted this concept of a promised land?
Some have interpreted it very literally, seeking to establish physical communities based on biblical principles. Others have viewed it more metaphorically, as a state of spiritual or social harmony that we can work towards, right here and now.
It's interesting how this ancient story can be so relevant to our lives even today. It speaks to our desire for freedom, for purpose, for a sense of belonging.
And it reminds us that the journey is just as important as the destination. The challenges we face along the way, the choices we make, the lessons we learn, they're all part of what shapes us and prepares us for that promised land, whatever it might look like in our own lives.
So as we reflect on Exodus chapter 3, what are some of the key takeaways that you think are the most relevant for our listeners today?
Well, one key takeaway is the importance of recognizing and then responding to those burning bush moments in our own lives. Those moments when we feel called to step outside of our comfort zones, to take on a challenge, to make a difference in the world.
And those moments, they can be subtle or dramatic, but I think they often involve that sense of urgency, like a feeling that something important is at stake.
Yeah, exactly. And another takeaway is the importance of trusting in a power greater than ourselves, even when things feel uncertain. Just like God promised to be with Moses, we can also tap into that source of strength and guidance and wisdom, especially to help us through those more difficult times.
And finally, it's important to remember that we're all part of something bigger. We're part of a narrative of liberation and hope that extends far beyond our individual lives. And we each have a role to play, a contribution to make in creating a more just and compassionate world.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're not alone in our struggles, and that even our small acts of kindness, courage, and compassion, they can create a ripple effect,
Yeah.
and they can contribute to this larger movement towards healing and wholeness.
I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Exodus chapter 3. We've explored the symbolism of the burning bush, the implications of God's name, and the ethical complexities of that whole borrowing of jewels situation. But we've also touched on some pretty timeless themes that are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago.
Themes like faith, leadership, resilience, justice, and the pursuit of a better future.
And as we move towards the final part of our deep dive, I want to encourage you, the listener, to consider how these themes resonate in your own life, in your own experiences, and in your hopes for the future. What are the burning bushes in your life? What challenges are calling you to step up and lead? And what promised lands are you striving towards? So we've explored a lot of profound ideas here in Exodus chapter 3, divine presence, challenging authority, and the promise of a better future. What stands out to you? I mean, what was the most impactful part of this whole chapter for you?
You know what really sticks with me is that connection between faith and action. The Israelites were promised this liberation, a land overflowing with milk and honey, but they can't just sit back and wait. They have to play their part.
Right, they're not just passive bystanders. They're being invited to participate in their own liberation.
That's it exactly. They have to trust in a power greater than themselves, absolutely.
Mhm.
But they also have to take those concrete steps, make bold choices, and even confront those in power. I mean, think about those instructions to borrow the jewels. Whether it was a demand for restitution or some kind of strategic move, it took a lot of courage and a willingness to, you know, challenge the status quo.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that faith isn't just about believing, it's about putting those beliefs into action. It's about taking those steps, even the small ones, to create the kind of change we want to see out there in the world.
If you're listening right now, think about the areas in your own life where you feel that call to action, that desire for change. Maybe it's a personal struggle you're facing. Maybe it's a social injustice that's weighing on you, or even a big creative project that feels really daunting. What would it look like for you to step into that space with both faith and action?
This whole chapter also highlights how important community is. The Israelites, they're not going on this journey alone. They're a collective. They're bound by shared history, by their faith, and by this vision for the future.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're not meant to go through life alone. We need each other for support, encouragement, and to keep each other accountable. We get strength from our connections, especially when we're facing those really tough challenges or when we're going after those big, ambitious goals.
I mean, think about the people in your life who inspire you, those who challenge you and support you. Who are the people that make up your tribe?
It's amazing how this story from thousands of years ago still feels so incredibly relevant today.
It really does. Those big themes in Exodus chapter 3, like facing your fears, challenging injustice, and striving for a better future, they're universal. We all experience them.
It's like the Israelites being called to leave their comfort zone and start their journey towards liberation. I think we're all invited to do the same, to step out in faith, trust in something bigger than ourselves, and do our part to create a more just and compassionate world.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Exodus chapter 3, I want to leave you with one final thought. What really resonated with you today? What new insights did you walk away with? And what questions are still lingering in your mind? Take some time to reflect on those things and let the wisdom from this ancient story guide you on your own journey. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.